Hello. Welcome to A View of Westford through the lens of John Sanders. This is Linda Green. I'm the director of the Westford Museum. On October 25th, 2023, at the Westford Historical Society's annual meeting, Marilyn Day, a former director of the Westford Museum and currently a board member of the Westford Historical Society, gave a special presentation on a collection of pictures from Westford from 1954 to 1968 by John Sanders. Mr. Sanders' pictures provided a unique view of Westford as the farmlands and orchards started to disappear and were replaced by housing developments, the introduction of Route 495, and high-tech industries into Westford. Who was John Sanders? How did we get his photographs? I'll leave that up to Marilyn Day to share with you.
When I finished scanning all 92 of the color slides taken by John Sanders in Westford, I said, these need to be shared. We have this wonderful slide collection, but not one photograph of John, other than newspaper clippings. His slides weren't taken that many years ago, in the 1950s through 1968. Have any of you ever met John over the years? Did you know him when he was in Westford? Actually, June Kennedy did. But the slides present a framework to share a little more history and are so beautiful. I'm delighted that you're able to share these with us. And just another word of explanation, I have added some pictures that were not taken by him in order to clarify and amplify some of the background to his slides. Again, thanks to June Kennedy, who had these slides tucked away in her Westford collection and donated them to the museum in 2020. Actually, June knew John Sanders personally, as he had been her RFD mail carrier where she grew up in Lexington, Mass. June says, John Sanders was my mailman when I moved to Lexington, Massachusetts in 1943. He walked his route carrying a large brown satchel. He was always very friendly to everyone. I remember I had a young friend who had climbed a tree and fell out of the tree and badly cut herself on the leg. John picked her up and carried her to her home next door. He was always kind and caring and loved children. I didn't know it at the time, I was only 8 years old, that John and Marion, his wife, were family members of my future husband, Charlie Kennedy. Anyway, when Charlie and I arrived home from our honeymoon in 1958, the Sanders arrived with food and frozen vegetables from their garden. Shortly after that, the Sanders took us to a barbecue at St. Mark's Church in Westford, and that's where I met Fran Fletcher. The day that we joined the church, the Sanders took us to dinner at the Manning Manson Billerica, and that's the Wilson family homestead, June's family. John introduced me to the Westford Historical Society, and when I became interested in writing Westford recollections, he drove me all around town and took pictures of the existing 10-room district schoolhouses. They weren't all one-room schoolhouses, but most of them were. And as John grew older, he gave me his original History of Westford by Hodgman, which was nice too. June then tells us about Betsy and the 4-H, and we'll finish that quote in a few more minutes, or more pictures. John was also a trustee of the J.V. Fletcher Library from 1956 to 1963, and as you will hear later, he was on the Westford Housing Authority. Although he was living in Westford by 1951, John was still a letter carrier in Lexington. It wasn't until 1958 that he applied for an indoor postal worker's position here in Westford. I think Lexington was sorry to see him leave. A newspaper clipping from the Lexington Minuteman dated 16 January 1958 stated, "Letter carrier here, now Westford clerk. John T. Sanders has accepted assignment to a clerical position at the Westford Post Office after 17 years as carrier in Lexington. He is very active in the Middlesex County 4-H organization." John Sanders continued to work for the post office in Westford from 1958 until his retirement in 1965. Here's some background on the post office building that John came to in 1958. As you may have heard, the location of the post office in the 1800s and into the 1900s depended on the political party in power. Being a postmaster was clearly a patronage position. So during a Republican administration, the PO was located at the Wright and Fletcher store on Main Street, and conversely, when the Democrats sat on the Hill, the post office was located in the Fletcher store at what is now 7 Lincoln Street, J.B. Fletcher's store. The patronage system carried on probably until 1971, when the post office became a non-government corporation. J. Herbert Fletcher, who had the store and post office at 7 Lincoln Street, where Conley's is today, preferred being a postmaster and not a grocery store owner or clerk. So on May 10, 1924, sisters Elizabeth Fletcher Wilson and Eva E. Fletcher sold a piece of land at 4 Lincoln Street to their brother, J. Herbert Fletcher. The piece of land was described as 74 feet on the town hall side, 12 feet across the back, 61 feet on the westerly side, and 50 feet on the street, which, if I did the math right, comes out to be about 4/100ths of an acre. And this postage stamp-sized lot became the site at 2 Lincoln Street, where the center post office was located from 1929 until early February 1961. In October 1924, Eva, Edith, and J. Herbert Fletcher sold the house at 4 Lincoln Street to Henry Eastman. Although Henry must have been living there already, according to the following description, when Herbert opened the post office in May 1929. Eva and J. Herbert Fletcher then moved into what is now 6 Lincoln Street. And this is the description from 1929 of the post office that John came to in 1958. The Westford Wardsman of May 25, 1929 reported, Mr. Fletcher has built a new post office on Lincoln Street, which opened for business on Wednesday, May 22, 1929. It is a very attractive building facing the Common, situated between the property of Mrs. Sarah Walker and Henry F. Eastman. The building is 18 by 26 feet and cost about $3,000. The exterior is finished in gray silver shingles with cream trimmings. The electrical fixtures are of wrought iron, and also the artistic holder for the new post office sign. Cement walks lead to the 2 doors, the front for public use and the side for the mail carriers. The interior woodwork is finished in walnut, and the walls are cream. 2 large windows face the street, and several others in each side give excellent light and ventilation. A new oil-burning plant will be used for heating purposes. Mr. Fletcher will also continue to sell candy, ice cream, tobacco, and novelties. You notice it says nothing about interior plumbing. I understand that they made use of the library facilities when it was open, and living right next door or right in the center, they probably scurried home. The women, anyway. And this is the center post office building described in 1929, where John came to work, beginning in 1958. J. Herbert Fletcher retired in 1948, and that year acting postmaster Henrietta R. McNiff wrote to Washington and said, "We are badly in need of all equipment, as the only things we have here are a few odds and ends, picked up to make it possible to carry on. In general, everything is obsolete and in need of repairs." Did Henrietta ever see any improvements? Here's the interior in 1955. This is Leo Cannell in 1955. Leo lived at 6 Boston Road. He served in World War I, worked for Wright Trucking for 18 years, superintendent of the town farm from 1938 to 1948. He became acting postmaster in Westford on September 29, 1948, replacing J. Herbert Fletcher, who retired that year. Leo Cannell retired in 1968. Here's fellow worker Pat O'Connell in 1955. Pat's name is actually John James O'Connell. The Westford Eagle of July 1st, 1971 stated he was appointed postmaster in Westford, effective June 26, 1971. His obituary stated he had been a special police officer for 41 years, town assessor for 25 years, and postmaster for Westford from 1968 until his retirement. He lived at 44 Main Street, the house that faces Canal Drive. He had a short commute. Bet he scurried home for lunch. In fact, remember Etta McNiff, who complained about the conditions of the post office? Her sister Lucy was the wife of Pat O'Connell. Several Westford people, worked here over the years. Ken Tebbett's mother, Margaret Sullivan, worked here as a young woman before her marriage to George Tebbetts. Eva Fletcher, who ran the store at 7 Lincoln Street and assisted there with the post office originally, was an assistant here as well. Hazel Hartford worked here part-time. Barbara Curley, who became the wife of Bill Prescott. And Frances Fletcher, was a longtime employee of the Postal Service. The post office moved in 1961 from Lincoln Street to 45 Main Street. The year before, in 1960, Alistair McDougall sold the empty lot at 45 Main Street to Diego and Dorothy Gerace. Remember, this is the site where the Abbott Mansion, dismantled in 1941, had stood. Mr. Gerace received a building permit in August that year to build a post office on the site of 45 Main Street, which he leased to the U.S. government. The post office was dedicated on February 18, 1961, and closed in March 1987, when the current post office building at 301 Littleton Road opened for business on March 30th. So what happened to the old building? Ellen Harde has the answers for that.
In the spring of 1967, my husband Mike and I bought 4 Lincoln Street, the White House just visible at the right of the slide of Herbert Fletcher's 1929 post office. Our house is the one that Marilyn refers to as, quote, the Henry Eastman House. With our new house came the empty post office building and its postage stamp lot. We'd only owned the house a month when the doorbell rang, and the woman at the door introduced herself as Norma Treat, a member of the Westford Garden Club. Norma said that every May the Garden Club held a plant sale on the Common, and if it rained the day of the sale, the previous owner of the old post office let the Garden Club move the sale inside the post office. Would we do the same? The answer was, of course. Plant sale turned out to be sunny day for the plant sale, so no indoor sale. But Norma's visit was a lovely way to be welcomed to Westford. The post office also introduced me to 9-year-old John Alling, whose family lived at 7 Boston Road, when Johnny and his friend Tom of 10 Hildreth Street threw a rock through one of the plate glass windows of the building. An inauspicious meeting, but the beginning of a long-time friendship with Johnny. By the spring of 1968, we realized that owning just 1/3 of an acre of land, the area that was taken up by the old post office was the only place we could have a yard. So it was decided to get rid of the post office building. Since it was still sturdy, we didn't want to tear it down. So that fall, when we were asked to help with a fundraising auction for Chandler Stevenson's campaign for Congress, we donated the post office to the auction. The high bidder just had to dismantle it and take it away. Someone actually bought it, but they never came to get it. Then the next year, in 1969, the doorbell rang again, and a man asked if he could take the post office apart and move it. He wanted to rebuild it on his property in Tingsboro to make a shop for his son to work on his car. All that summer and fall, he moved the building beam by beam and joist by joist, and in the empty spot, we put up a swing set since we now had sons Christopher and Josh. My only regret is that we have no record of the new owner of the 1929 post office or its new address in Hingsboro.
Thank you, Ellen. John Sanders recorded the move from 2 Lincoln Street to the new post office building at 45 Main Street. It was the social event of the year. 150 guests attended. The Academy Band was there. The Tadmont Club provided refreshments, and even the library closed at the time of the ceremony. We have Mr. Gerace's truck here moving the contents from the old post office. The post office building was taken and photographed by Ann Kirk, probably about 1964 or 5. Pat O'Connell is unpacking and organizing himself in this new location. Fran Fletcher is readying the new boxes. Notice those shoes up on the shelf. Hey, this is a new building. Freddie Robinson, he had lived on Boston Road. And now we have these cute little kids mailing letters. Here we have Selectman Horace Wyman, better known as Hoppy. He was owner of Wyman's Beach on Long Sought-for Pond, as well as Wyman's Lunch in Forge Village, and he was a selectman for 18 years. This is the crowd at the dedication. In the front row, right to left, we have Ruth Tuttle wearing that blue hat. Frances Fletcher with her 2 sons, David and Harold. Harold was called Haffy. You may know him. Clarence Byrne is seated 2 to the left of Fran. In the second row, we have Ethel Shea and Zena Ingalls. Another view of the crowd. There was seating for 150 guests in that little building. This, as I said, was a major event in town. Thomas Taylor giving the ode to the flag. Thomas was in his junior year at Westford Academy and was the stepson of Roger Hildreth and his wife, Grace Taylor. The Legion Color Guard prepares to raise the new flag. You can see Pat O'Connell's house across the street in that slide. And who are these delightful kids mailing letters at the new P.O.? Now we see John's other contributions to town, starting with his involvement in 4-H. Westford 4-H Citizenship Club raised funds in 1963, 1969, and again in 1974 to purchase a new ambulance for the Westford Fire Department. The town had gotten a new ambulance in February 1947, and this was the first replacement since then. I found it interesting that even though 4-H was not a part of town government, that there were 4-H reports appearing in the Westford Town Reports in 1957 through 1961. In May 1969, the 4-H performed a townwide canvass to raise money for a new ambulance. And this is June's other quote. June Kennedy said, "And my daughter Betsy remembers when she was about 10 years old that John, who was very active in 4-H and was raising money for the ambulance in Westford, drove Betsy from house to house, and she would go in and ask for funding. They raised the money, and the ambulance was presented to the town on May 17, 1969, at the Westford Kiwanis Apple Blossom Festival." Again, through John's involvement in 4-H, he was instrumental in helping create the memorial to Richard St. Onge. Richard had died at the barn fire, at the Lewis Dairy Barn Fire in South Chelmsford on December 5, 1970, probably due to cardiac failure. In the Westford Eagle of December 10th that year, John Sanders told how Richard had been a member of the 4-H Woodworking Club. Richard died at age 29. He left his wife Gloria and a 4-month-old daughter, Margot Louise, as well as his parents, Richard and Jean St. Onge, and siblings. Richard's mother was then the fire dispatcher. The family lived right here at 4 Boston Road. In fact, it was only a year later that his mother died. In 1968, John began lobbying to establish a housing authority in Westford. 3 years later, in 1971, the new housing authority was created, and in 1972, the members elected him as chairman of the board. From that time until his retirement as chairman in 1975. The affordable senior housing on Tadmont Road was their first major project, and on September 1st, 1974, 48 affordable units opened, and residents began moving into 65 Tadmuck Road. Here's a slide of Boston Road and the houses we're going to be talking about. When John and Marion came to Westford in 1951, they bought the house at 24 Boston Road from Edna Currier. Edna was a granddaughter of Wayland Balch, who had lived here since 1897. Previously, the Balches had lived at 246 Concord Road. Wayland's daughter, Mary or May Balch, wrote about that 1897 purchase. She says, "A little later, Father went to an auction, one of his favorite pastimes. Long observant of the profit or loss that a farm landscape presents, he bid. Quite unexpectedly, he found he had purchased a farm in Westford Center. Surprising himself, he drove home, I think convinced and happy in the thought that it would please Mother. And it did. That summer we had to work 2 farms, one with cattle, both with hay, and fruits of all kinds. And the buildings in the center needed much repair. If I ever thought we didn't have much, when we moved, I found we did." Wayland bought it from Luther Wilkins on May 11, 1897. It had included buildings and 14 acres of land. 14 acres right there on Boston Road. But when John Sanders bought the property at 24 Boston Road in 1951, it only included 5.85 acres of land. John divided the lot again at 24 Boston Road, and then he built the house at 26 Boston Road on 3.52 acres for himself and Marion. In 1953, he sold 24 Boston Road, then consisting of 2.33 acres, to Ivan and Doris Thunberg. And the Thunbergs sold to Ralph and Janie Hinckley in 1967. Number 24 is owned today by Bob Waskevich. Here are a few more views of 24 Boston Road in all kinds of weather. And as I say, if you're sick of snow, you don't have to look at them. A current view of 26 Boston Road. John sold the property in 1961 to Richard and Mabel Kersley, and they sold to Robert and Brenda Connell in 1965. Today, Andrew and Laurie Pila own 26 Boston Road. Here's John's view of 26 Boston Road from 1955. John's slides begin in August 1955 with a sunrise from the back of their house. In this view from the back, you are looking east toward Chelmsford. At that time, Route 495 didn't exist. No Hampton Inn on the horizon. Route 495 would not open until 1961. Kings Pine, Crown Road have not yet been developed. We have several views of 26 Boston Road. Views behind 26 Boston Road in 1955 and 56, and in 1957 a rainbow. John has this wonderful slide in his collection which says, "Taken by Miss Prescott." This was Mabel, or Minnie Prescott. Mamie Prescott. Mamie was born in 1898 and died in 1993, and she lived at 32 Boston Road. You catch parts of her house in some of these pictures. There was another house here that burned in 1899, and it was Mamie's father, Nathan Prescott, who built the one pictured here. After Mamie's death in 1993, the house was taken down, and a street named Mamie Lane was put in, with yet another new house on that site at 32 Boston Road. A few paragraphs back, I mentioned Wayland Balch. He served in the Civil War and was Westford's last Civil War veteran. In 1928, Wayland Balch sold 24 Boston Road to his married daughter, Lena Currier. At the same time, he also sold the piece of land that became 30 Boston Road to his daughter, Mary or May Balch. About 1928 or 29, May Balch had the house built at 30 Boston Road for herself and her father. May wrote, "Father very gradually gave up his work and we could no longer plant the gardens together. The empty barn was a lonely place. No cows nosing into the hay, no whinny from the stalls, and after a while it seemed best to both of us that we sell the farm and build upon our land a smaller house that I could more easily care for. This slide is interesting. This is one where you see Mamie Prescott's house at 32 Boston Road. But you also see that there is nothing to the left of the house at 30 Boston Road. Wayland Balch died in 1937. And in August 1947, Edna Currier, Wayland's granddaughter, sold a piece of land to May, abutting her current house at 30 Boston Road. And May built what she calls the Little House, stating in her memoir, "So once more I whittled down my stock of house furnishings, most of which had endured the wear and tear of several generations, building a new and simple little house. This became 28 Boston Road. She sold her other house at 30 Boston Road in August 1947 to the family of Robert G. Chandler, and they sold to George and Harriet Walker in 1949. The Walkers had a son, David, born in 1947. As most of you probably know, May was an artist. I love this painting of David Walker when he was 9 years old, shoveling Hearst sidewalk in 1956. May would have sales of her artwork in her home. She had greeting cards and I don't know what else. Shirley Byrne McDougall said that she used to play croquet behind May Balch's house and said that May had rocks painted in her backyard that looked like frogs and toads. By 1958, May's health began to slide, and that year she sold the Little House to John and Marion Sanders. Maybe there was an agreement that May could remain in the house. John added on to the Little House, and in late September of 1961, he and Marion moved in. The Lowell Sun of September 27, 1961 stated, "Mr. and Mrs. Sanders have moved into their new home, the former home of Mary G. Balch. Their big house has been sold to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Kearsley." The following day, the paper reported that Mary G. Balch was a patient at Lowell General Hospital, and this is where she died on October 1st. John and Marion lived here until 1974, when they sold number 28 Boston Road to Thomas and Pamela Cahill. Later it went to Robert C. and Marie German Sullivan, and then to Carol Avery. Carol had the Little House demolished about 2004. Patrick and Jill McGinn partnered with Carol Avery and the Town Historical Commission to preserve and relocate the house, then at 30 Boston Road, over to 28 Boston Road. When you're upstairs at the museum, you can see two of the decorated doors painted by May Balch that came out of the Little House and were donated by Carol Avery. Ektachrome. Ektachrome. This is what an Ektachrome slide from 1950 looks like today. When I first scanned it, it didn't seem as though I could do much to improve the quality. But then in Photoshop, I noticed a feature called color correction. What the heck, I thought, and here are the results. Ektachrome was about the worst color film ever made. Color fading was an early issue, and Kodak just kept selling it, according to Ron Polito. This is the house at 28 Boston Road, and you're looking across the street and seeing the garage at 29 Boston Road, where Paul Roit lives. Chris Evans says, "I believe this car is either a 62 or a 63 American Rambler." When I asked him, he replied, "Anytime. It's always fun trying to figure out these old cars." Chris is such a great car expert, and he's always so enthusiastic with my little mysteries. We'll wrap this up with a few more miscellaneous slides. Here are some pheasants. I don't get it. fish and game, released young pheasants in the spring, and then they were hunted in the fall. John must have commuted past this property on his way to and from Lexington. He named it Kemp's Roses. This is 767 Bedford Road in Carlisle. Edward Field Kemp and his wife Beulah lived here. He was the founder of E.F. Kemp Company, a wholesale nut and candy firm in Somerville. The Carlisle Public Library, the Gleason Public Library, provided that information for us. So, where in Westford is it? This is Route 495. We have views of Fletcher Quarry from 1960. Somewhere I read that as a young man, John Sanders had worked here, probably in the office. And we have two views of Boston Road from 1955. Even today, before construction has fully begun, we look at these pictures and marvel that this is Boston Road. A winter scene of Boston Road. This one was undated. Charlie Hildreth's house at 25 Boston Road in March 1958. There seems to be no mention of the selectmen riding in a dirigible, but in the 1957 town report, in the selectmen's report under building permits issued, there was a permit issued for a radar tower. And how many radar towers do we have in Westford? Now we're looking at a map showing the Knowlton's house on Hunt Road. The Knowlton's daughter, Priscilla Knowlton, born at Chelmsford in 1919, died in New Hampshire March 20th, 2011. In 1941, she married Kenneth Richard Hill. Priscilla and Kenneth built the house at 45 Chamberlain Road and operated Hill's Orchard on Hunt Road in Westford. Their son, also named Kenneth Richard Hill, lastly ran it. It's just a spectacular view looking down Chamberlain Road toward Main Street. And in this one, we're looking down Chamberlain Road in the other direction, toward Lowell Road. You can see the mountains on the horizon, the mountains of New Hampshire. Cindy and Clyde Prescott lived in the old house at 181 Main Street at the corner of Chamberlain Road. The view is from the corner of Chamberlain across to 31 Tadmouth Road, the current Keith Boney property. And then the view back again from Keith's house back toward the corner of Main and Chamberlain. And like the old car put out to pasture, we've reached the end of our slides. John died in 1983 and Marion in 1987. They are interred in Fairview Cemetery, and what a wonderful tribute that the 4-H insignia is included on their gravestone. And what a wonderful collection of slides he has left us. Thank you all.